Good morning, scholars. Today we're going to continue our way through Pharr's Homeric Greek, our general course in comprehensive ancient Greek, dealing with lesson 35 of Pharr, irregular verbs in me, that's eme and peime, and also Enclitics and Proclitics. Now, I'll begin this just with a little story. When I was still a graduate student at Berkeley, I was very interested in trying to improve my pronunciation. And so one day I went to the office hours of Anthony Bullock, the famous late specialist in Hellenistic philosophy, Callimachus and stuff. And I asked him about it, and the first thing he mentioned, the first thing he said, it surprised me, was about Inclitics and Proclitics. That these are essential to you having proper pronunciation, because as we'll see, Proclitics adhere closely to the word that follow them, and Inclitics to the word that precedes them. So in order to get the real rhythm and I guess you'd call it, the rate of Greek pronunciation going, you have to respect Proclitics leaning forward and Inclitics leaning backwards. So, Proclitics. What's a proclitic? So, reading Smythe 179. 10 monosyllabic words have no accent and are closely connected with the following word. They are called proclitics, from proklino, to lean forward. They are, first off, the forms of the article that begin with a vowel, ha, he, hoi, hi. Then the prepositions en, ace, s, ex, ek. The conjunction a, and then hos, as, that, and also when it's the preposition to. And finally, the negative adverb ook. These are your proclitics. Now, the fine point is that a proclitic will take an accent. Thus, case A, oo at the end of a sentence. So, pes e oo, do you say so or not? Or, very common in Plato, poskar oo, for why not? Or simply oo, standing alone, no. And then X, N, and ace receive an acute in poetry when they follow the word to which they belong and stand at the end of the verse. So, kakon X, out of evils. And then hos, as, becomes hos with an acute in poetry when it follows its noun. So, the hos, as a god. Likewise, hos standing for hutos is written hos with an acute even in prose. Ud hos, not even thus. And finally, when a proclitic precedes an enclitic, it receives an accent, intese, among them, or among someone. Okay. Enclitics, on the other hand, from enclino, lean on, lean upon, are words attaching themselves closely to the preceding word, after which they are pronounced rapidly. So enclitics usually lose their accent, and they are A, the personal pronouns mu, moi, me, su, soi, se, hu, hoi, he, and in poetry, spise. Then B, the indefinite pronouns tis, te, someone, something, in all cases, including tu, toi, for tenos, tene, but excluding ata, for tena. Then as well, the indefinite adverbs pu or pote, pe, poi, poten, pote, po, and pos. So remember when I presented this, I said indefinite enclitic, indefinite enclitic. Now, when used as interrogatives, these words are not enclitic. So tis, tu, pu, pote, pe, poi, poten, pote, te, pos, po. Those are not enclitics when they're interrogatives. Who, what, where, in which way, whither, from where, when, etc. Then C, all dissyllabic forms of the present indicative of ame, am, and peme, say, are enclitic. So that is all forms except the second singulars, a and pace. And then D, the particles ge, te, toi, and per, which we see a lot of in Homer. And then the inseparable de, as in hode, tosode, etc. Now, enclitics, when they retain their accent, are called orthotone. And we'll talk about that technical term as well as others very soon. So, but most important, or among the most important, is the fact that these enclitic are the dissyllabic forms of the present indicative of ame, am, and peme. So you see on this chart, I placed in yellow all the forms that are enclitic. Ame, este, esmen, este, ese, and then peme, pese, pamen, pate, pase, whereas the second singulars, a and pace, are not enclitic. Now, looking at these verbs, peme first, you see peme, pace, pese, pamen, pate, pase in the indicative. And then looking at the subjunctive, you should recognize the endings that you should be familiar with for the active subjunctive, o, es, a, etc., with your iota subscript, omen, eta, ose. And then when you get to the optative, you should be on the lookout. You see that the stem vowel has reverted to the short alpha, but you have that insertion of the iota, which is your mark of the optative. So, pain, pais, pae, paimen, paete, paen. And then the imperative is somewhat strange in that you have the theta iota forms, pate, enclitic, or pate, non-enclitic, pato, pate, panton. And then the imperfect, epein, epesta, or epes, epe, epamen, epate, epasan. And these simply take repetition drills and reciting out loud to oneself, but there's a certain sense in which they are easily enough recognizable once you get outside the indicative by, as I say, the endings associated with the subjunctive, the iota of the optative, and the augment of the imperfect. But nevertheless, there's work to be done here. Now, ame, on the other hand, is likewise has some of the same characteristics that allow you to recognize it. Outside of the indicative, ame, a, este, esmen, este, ese, you have the subjunctive, strangely enough, just seems to be the endings that we are used to, o, ese, omen, eta, ose. And then the optative, you see the epsilon with the iota, and then the endings, ein, ace, a, amen, eta, asan. And then in the plural, you have these alternative forms, amen, eta, an. And then the imperative, iste, that just has to be learned, esto, let him be, este, you be, eston, let them be. And then when you get to the imperfect, ein, that's a little weird because you see that the first person singular and third person singular have the same form, that an, and in the second person esta, and then amen, ete, or este, rare, and then esan. And again, I think the imperfect just takes some repetition drills and getting used to, but like I've said again and again, these adverbs, you have to always refer to these pages of Smythe until you start to get them down. Ani, the infinitive, is pretty straightforward. Then the participle, on, usa on, ontos, uses, ontos, etc. See section 305. And then the future forms. The future, strangely enough, has middle forms. So esomai, ese, estai, etc. And then so in the optative, esoimein and esestai for your infinitive, and your participle, esomenos, esomene, esomenon. So again, these just have to be worked with repetition drills until you've learned them. But with regards to the present indicative, there are some tricks if you are inclined to indulge in the phonetic rules or principles, because the stem of ame is actually epsilon sigma. You can see, I suggest you just freeze, pause with this slide, and look up these sections of Smythe so you see what's going on, how you've actually gotten these forms from the stem, epsilon sigma, which shows most clearly, of course, in the first person and second person plural, esmen, este. Now, before we talk about Enclitics, we should take our little bow to Aristophanes of Byzantium, not to be confused, of course, with the comic poet of Socrates' era. Reading Smythe 161, the invention of the marks of accent is attributed to Aristophanes of Byzantium, a librarian at Alexandria in Egypt, about 200 BC. The use of signs served to fix the correct accentuation, which was becoming uncertain in the 3rd century BC, marked by the variation of dialect usage. And this production of accents, this part always amuses me, that the accents rendered the acquisition of Greek easier for foreigners, because it told you how to accent the word. Now, the signs for the accents and the breathings were not regularly employed in manuscripts until after 600 AD. So let's look very quickly at this little timeline of late classical and Hellenistic scholarship, linguistic scholarship. So it begins with Aristotle's pupil Theophrastus, who it was responsible for the concept of the parts of speech and the doctrine of the syllogism. And then our man Aristophanes of Byzantium, who wrote Scholia, Remarks on Homer, and invented the accents and punctuation. You have to remember that paper was very rare or very hard to come about in these times. So the manuscripts were written all crammed together without spaces even between the words, because they just couldn't spare that in their writing. And then next you have Aristarchus, whose dates are kind of uncertain, the most prominent Homeric scholar. He wrote an edition of Homer and also many treatises, most of which are lost, and he is a big influence on the later Scholia to the Homeric poems. So this guy, Aristophanes of Byzantium, he's the one who gives us even a fighting chance to render Greek accents correctly. Now, as we saw earlier, there are 3 accents in Greek. No Greek accent can fall further back than the third from the last syllable. So you have the acute over short and long vowels and diphthongs, and it may stand on either the ultima, the penult, or the antepenult. Kalos, daimon, anthropos. And it's marked or represents a raising of the voice. The circumflex, which marks a raising and fall of the voice, so I always imagine a horse jumping over a fence, occurs over vowels that are long by nature and over diphthongs. It can stand either on the last syllable or second from the last syllable. So, ga, da'u, doron, tuto. And then the grave, which represents a lowering of the voice, stands over long or short syllables and diphthongs. But it stands on the final syllable only. So, ton andra, ten tuken, hoi te oi des helados. Now, as in many cases, technical terms have been created to describe where the accent lies. So, Smythe 157, words are named according to their accent as followed. An oxytone has an acute on the ultima on the last syllable. Der, kalos, lelukos. A paroxytone has an acute on the penult, the second from the last syllable. Luo, lepo, lelukotos. A proparoxytone has an acute on the third from the last syllable, the antepenult. Anthropos, paideuomen. A perispomenon has a circumflex on the ultima. Ge, deu. A properispomenon has a circumflex on the penult, or second from the last accent, syllable. Proxys, musa. And then a baritone is when the ultima is unaccented. So any syllable where the ultima, the last syllable, does not have an accent is considered a baritone. Musa, mater, polemos. So 158, a word is called baritone, deep-toned, low-tone, barutonos, when it has no accent on the ultima. So thus, all paroxytones, proparoxytones, and properispomena are also baritones. So, oxytone, reading 160, means sharp-toned. Perispomenon means turned about. And pro-oxytone, pro-paraoxytone are derived from oxytonos with the prepositions para, beside, and pro, before, respectively. Acute corresponds to the Latin acutus, which means sharp, prosodiia. So a sharp tone. Okay, hope that really raised your boat. But here comes the important part that leads us to the phenomenon of Enclitics. The grave is written in place of a final acute on a word that is followed immediately by another word in the sentence. So again, a grave is written in place of an acute on a word that is followed immediately by another word in the sentence. Thus, meta, tain, maken, after the battle, where you see that the acutes of meta and tain have been turned into graves because of the words that follow them. It is also sometimes placed on tis or te to distinguish the indefinite pronouns from the interrogatives, tis, te. Now, reading A, the oxytone changes its acute to a grave when followed by another word, except, number 1, when an oxytone is followed by an enclitic, and so we'll get to that. Number 2, tis, te, when they're interrogative. So tis hutos, who's this? And 3, when an elided syllable follows an accented syllable. So nuk to lane, the whole night, would not receive the grav, would not turn the acute into a grav, because the alpha has been elided from nukta. It's theta, of course, because of the rough breathing of halain. And then finally, the acute does not turn to a grav when a colon or a period follows. And different editors have their usage vary before a comma. Now, interesting point 155. The ancients regarded the grav originally as belonging to every syllable, not accented with the acute or circumflex. Thus, some manuscripts show this practice. So you would have pancrates. Later, it was restricted to its use as a substitute for a final acute. Okay, so it's this rule of the transformation of a final acute to a grav when another word follows that is what gets destabilized by the phenomenon of Enclitics. So, the accent of an enclitic, when it is thrown back upon the preceding word, always appears as an acute. So you have theta, there is the word for animal or beast, not theta. So the circumflex of there becomes actually an acute when it's thrown back from an enclitic. Now, here at 183, A through E, you have the rules for what happens to a word that precedes an enclitic. And these are quite complex to get straight. So we will look at them one by one in the following slides. But just to go through them very quickly, well, no, I'm going to go using the slides. So, before an enclitic, an oxytone keeps its accent and does not change to an acute from a grav. So, dosmoi kalon este. You see, the acute does not become a grav because the enclitic almost attaches right to the word, the previous word. So we saw this in line 26. Me se geron, koile sen ego, etc. Me se. Now, in all these slides, I've marked the enclitic with this magenta color. Now, 183b, before an enclitic, a perispomenon keeps its accent. So, bilose, or timon, tenon. (183c), before an enclitic, a proparoxytone or properispomenon receive as an additional accent an acute on the ultima. So you end up with these anthropos. So you see anthropos actually has two accents, one on the first syllable and then one that is received from the enclitic. So you get anthropostes. And likewise, anthropoitenes. And then in line 13 of Book 1 of the Iliad, we had lusomenoste dugatra, where the lusomenoste, that accent before the te, comes from the te. Thus, lusomenos has two accents. So to ekusatenon, I hear or heard some men. And then likewise, paides tenes. So you see that where you have the pro-perispomenon, the circumflex on the second from the last accent, on the second from the last syllable, you get the acute on the last syllable, paides tenes, some sons or certain sons. And then we saw this in line 37, plutemu, arguro tox, plutemu. So that acute over the iota comes from the enclitic genitive of the first person singular personal pronoun. Hear me, silver bowled one. Plutemu, arguro tox. So to repeat the rule, before an enclitic, a proparoxytone or properispomenon, that is a word with an acute on the third from the last syllable, or a word with a circumflex on the second from the last syllable, receives an additional accent, that is an acute on the ultima. So study those examples. Now next, before an enclitic, a paroxytone receives no additional accent. So that is to say, if you have an acute on the second from the last syllable, and a monosyllabic enclitic loses its accent, simply loses its accent. So you have korates, a certain some land, bilos mu, a friend of mine, and we saw this in line 17. Atre idai te kai aloi eukne medes akaioi. You see that the accent of the enclitic, the monosyllabic enclitic, just simply loses its accent, and before that word which has a acute on the second from the last syllable. Now, a dissyllabic enclitic, however, retains its accent, except when its vowel is elided. So you have koros tenos, the lands of someone, or piloi tenes, certain friends. And here, the enclitic retains its accent because it's dissyllabic. Now, before an enclitic, a proclitic takes an acute. So remember that in a U were all proclitics. That meant they usually didn't have an accent. They just have the smooth breathing. But before an enclitic, they do receive that accent from the enclitic. So en tener, a tenes, and then from lines 88 and 93, utis mus dontes, kai epitoni der komenoio. The utis, the u has received the acute from tis, and then also from line 93, u tar ho gu goles, epi mem petai ud hecatombes. Actually, we have two instances of it here, because u receives an accent from te, elided, and then actually the ho receives an accent from ge, elided, hoge. I didn't notice this, so that ge is not marked in magenta, but it should be. So here we have the fact that before an enclitic, a proclitic receives the accent of the enclitic, following enclitic. Okay, Now, finally, when you have several enclitics occur in succession, each receives an accent from the following, while the last one has no accent. So it's almost like a traffic jam where everyone gets their rear bumper smashed except the last person. So, first example from Thucydides, if ever anyone saw the enemy anywhere, so you have ever, anyone, anywhere, these indefinites, e pu tis tena idoi ex thron. So pu tis tena are all indefinite enclitics, but an a, of course, is a proclitic. So a got the accent from pu, kept its acute, tis kept its acute, but tena lost its accent. So again, when several enclitics occur in succession, each receives an accent from the following, whereas the last has no accent. And so we've seen this in line 39 and 106 of the Iliad, Book 1, Smin theo e potatoi. So again, a is a proclitic, so it gets an accent from pote, and then pote gets its accent from toi, and toi doesn't have an accent. And then 106, man tikakon u po pote moi to kreguon e pes. I wonder if the accent, if I should actually have an accent on the oo here. I'm going to have to look at that, but I'm sorry. But do notice that po pote moi, you have po retains its accent, pote retains its accent, both getting it from the following one, but moi does not have an accent. So I'll have to check the text to see if that oo should even have an accent, because it is a proclitic followed by an enclitic, so you would think it would. Okay, so the last slide here is just a cover of some old German edition of Nauk, of the fragments of Aristophanes of Byzantium, who, as I said earlier, gave us a fighting chance in at least attempting to get the accents correct in our pronunciation of ancient Greek. Okay, so have a good day, and I hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.